In the last video, we discussed Ghazali's distinction between what we call substantial attributes, necessary attributes, and accidental attribute or accidents. And we saw that his basic criterion for making this distinction is, so you have substantial attributes, then you have, and he called them al-lazim, then you have necessary attributes. The first one, these are called al-dhati, and these are called al-lazim, and accidental attribute or just accident in al-aradi, as-sifat al-aradi al-arid. And the basic criterion through which he makes these distinction is that if a property or an attribute in a conception of a thing doesn't ever separate from a thing, then that attribute is either a dhati, substantial attribute, or a lazim, a necessary attribute. And then he makes the distinction between the substantial attribute and the necessary attribute by saying that although both the substantial and necessary attributes don't separate from a conception of a thing, only substantial attribute is part of the essence of a thing, or rather conception of a thing. And although necessary attributes don't separate from the conception of a thing, they are not part of the essence of a thing. And accidents are simply those attributes which we can separate from the thing in our conception of a thing. So, for example, conception of a tree, for example, or a conception of a horse. So body is part. We can't think of a tree in our mind without thinking of a body. We can't think of a horse without thinking of a body. And we can't ever think, we can think of different scenarios, different trees from different angles, a horse, different colors, different angles, etc. Whatever we do, we always find that horse has a body and a tree has a body, so they don't separate. And we try to think if we can think of a horse without a body and we can't, and a tree without a body. So that mental gymnastic proves that body is, firstly, it is essential attribute of a horse and tree, but it's a type of essential attribute that is part of the reality or the essence of a thing, so that we can't think of that thing without thinking of that attribute. So that proves that this is a substantial attribute or الصفة الذاتي. Okay. Now, then we have other attributes which we can't separate in our mind from a thing, but we can think of that thing without considering that attribute. So, for example, color as such, because color as such is sort of employed in a body. We can't think of a body without any color. Or Ghazali's example was we can't think of a body ever separated from its shade in the right condition. So that we can't separate. So we can think of white horse, or we can think of black horse. So whiteness and blackness are separable from horse, but color as such is not separable from horse. And similarly, we can't think of a horse which doesn't have a shade in the right condition. Although when we think of a horse, we don't need to think of a color as such or think of even shade. So we can think of the essence of a horse without color as such or without a shade, but we can't separate it from. So that proves that this color as such or a shade are necessary attributes, but they are not substantial attributes, because we can think of that thing without thinking of that attribute. And the last, accident is easy because it is separable from. So we can think of a tree without color green. So green is a accident. We can think of a horse without red color. So red is accident as far as accidental attribute of a horse, a particular horse. So that's what we look at last time. But here I wanted to look at a couple of more things which we didn't touch on the last time, and one is his distinction between two types of distinction between two types of substantial attributes. So he said substantial attribute is divided into two types. وَالذَّاتِ يَنْقَسِمُ إِلَىٰ عَامٍ. So the substantial attribute would either be general or yusamma jinsan, and that the general substantial attribute is known as genus or jins. And ila khasin, or we have substantial attribute of a thing which is particular, and that is called naw, or species. And then he goes on to say that فَإِنْ كَانَ الذَّاتِيُ الْعَامُ لَا عَامَّ مِنْهُ سُمِّيَ جِنْسَ الْأَجْسَادِ. So if there is an attribute which is so general that there's nothing general we can think above that, then we will call it the genus of the genus, or jins al-ajnas. Or on the other hand, if we have a particular attribute that we can't think of anything more particular than that, then we call it the novel anwa, or species of a species. So it says وَالذَّاتِ يَنْقَسِمُ إِلَىٰ عَامٍ وَيُسَمَّى جِنْسًا وَإِلَىٰ خَاصٍ وَيُسَمَّى نَوْعًا فَإِنْ كَانَ الذَّاتِيُّ الْعَامُ لَا أَعَمَّ مِنْهُ سُمِّيَ جِنْسَ الْأَجْنَاسِ وَإِنْ كَانَ الذَّاتِيُّ الْخَاصُ لَا أَخَصَّ مِنْهُ سُمِّيَ نَوْعَ الْأَنْوَاعِ. So we went from dividing attributes into three types. So you have substantial attribute, necessary attributes, and then accidents. And these are divided into general and particular. And general is genus, or particular is species. It's called a species, and if general is such that there's no other more general thing can be imagined beyond that, then you call it jinsul ajanas, genus of genuses. And if there's a particular, there's no further particular can be thought or imagined beyond that, we will call it null anwa, or the species. But you should remember that this only belongs to the substantial property. So genus and species are subcategories of substantial properties or substantial attributes. The last thing, so then he goes on to say that he talks about whether existence is substantial property or not, and his answer is no. And his reason for that is simple, that we can think of a thing without thinking of its existence. So it doesn't really matter for a conception of thing whether that thing actually exists in reality outside our mind. And that's what he says here. So he said, because we defined substantial property as a property which we can't separate from a thing, and without which we can't think of a concept of a thing in our mind. So then he says, قل لم نعني في هذا الاصطلاح بالجنس العام فقط، بل عنينا العام الذي هو ذاتيا للشيء، أي داخل في جواب ما هو، بحيث لو بطل عن الذهن التصديق بثبوته بطل المحدود وحقيقته عن الذهن وخرج عن كونه مفهوما للعقل. وعلى هذا الاصطلاح فالموجود لا يدخل في الماهية، إذ بطلانه لا يوجب زوال الماهية عن الذهن. So he's saying that's why existence is not a substantial property. And in fact, he doesn't say it here, but we can understand from what he is saying is that it's not even a necessary property, because we can think of a existence separable from a thing. So a concept of a horse doesn't require us to think of existence in order to understand this essence. And similarly, we can think of existence separable from a concept of a horse. In that sense, for Ghazali here, existence is just an accident. And that's why he's saying that if somebody says that, what's the definition of a triangle? So we can say to them that it is a shape which has three angles. And if somebody says, what is al-musabba? Then we will say it's a shape which has seven sides. It's a heptagon. So a person would understand the definition of a heptagon or triangle without knowing whether heptagon exists outside his mind. So وَإِن لَمْ يَعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْمُسَبَّى مَوْجُودٌ فِي الْعَالَمِ أَصْلًا. So فَبُطْلَانُ الْعِلْمِ بِوُجُودِهِ لَا يُبْطِلُ عَنْ ذَهْنِهِ فَهْمَ حَقِيقَةَ الْمُسَبَّى. So in order to understand the definition of or the reality of a heptagon, a person doesn't need to know whether heptagon exists or not. And even if we are wrong in thinking that heptagon exists outside, that is not going to nullify our conception of a heptagon. And that proves that existence is not part of the concept of a thing or part of the essence of a things. Otherwise, if it were a part of the existence of a thing or part of the essence of a thing, then we couldn't have be able to think of a thing without knowing that it exists. So that was, I think, an important point here, that I think existence is not a substantial attribute. And in fact, as I said, it's not even a necessary attribute. It's just an accident, because we can think of existence as separable from a concept, and we can think of a concept of a thing without even thinking of whether it exists outside our mind or not. So that's and this point to something about Ghazali's method here. Although he's thinking about he's talking about logic and definitions, but his method is mental and it involves two things: abstraction. So we think of these distinctions through abstracting things and seeing whether we still have the concept of that thing. Another thing is imagination, because and that's why we don't need to worry about whether the things exist or not. And we will take up these two important aspects later on, but here I want to emphasize this point, that Ghazali, in order to in Ghazali's conception for the meaning of a concept, we don't need to worry about its external reality or existence outside our mind. And in order to know the essence of a thing, what we need to know is imagine different scenarios in our mind and see what we can subtract from a concept without totally losing that concept. And that method is the method of abstraction. The method of abstraction obviously is old, and Aristotle uses it. the method of imagination is more modern, in the sense that, as it is emphasized by Kant and Heidegger. So that's an interesting aspect of his classification here. I'm just referring to it here, and I'll pick up and talk about it a bit more detail in another video sometime. Thank you.